Welcome to Mastering Mystical Mysteries, where AI meets the ancient wisdom of esoteric literature. In each episode, we explore spiritual and occult books, revealing hidden truths through advanced AI analysis. Whether you are a seasoned seeker or simply curious about the mystical, we uncover knowledge from across the world's traditions. Today, we are diving into another thought-provoking text filled with spiritual insight and occult wisdom. If you enjoy our journey into the unknown, please remember to subscribe, comment, and like to stay connected with future revelations. Let us begin.
Ready for some serious mind-bending today? We're diving into Meister Eckhart, this medieval mystic with some, intense ideas about connecting with the divine.
Intense is a good word for him.
We're looking at his Sermon 3, focusing on the idea of the eternal birth, this kind of inner transformation he talks about.
Yeah, Eckhart's writings can be tough to decipher, but they're full of these really profound insights.
Oh, absolutely. In this sermon, he's tackling these huge questions like our relationship with God, the nature of our soul.
Yeah, how we're supposed to connect with something bigger when, the world's constantly pulling us in a million directions.
Which even back then, those distractions were real.
Oh, totally. And that's something Eckhart really hones in on. He's talking about finding inner peace amidst all the chaos, but he's not sugarcoating it.
Not at all. He's saying flat out, this inner birth takes some serious effort. He even compares it to a kind of violence, like you got to be ready to fight for it.
He uses this really vivid phrase, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force.
Whoa.
But before you start picturing some kind of spiritual battleground, it's important to remember he's not talking about physical force. It's more like, imagine trying to focus on a single thought with a million things screaming for your attention.
Oh, yeah.
That's the kind of struggle he's talking about.
Oh, I see.
It's the inner strength it takes to disconnect from all the noise, all the distractions that bombard us constantly, and just quiet the mind.
Yeah, it's like we're so used to being plugged in all the time. Finding that off switch feels impossible.
Exactly. It's like a total system reset for our brains, you know? And once we manage to create that inner stillness, Eckhart says, okay, now we need to shift how we even use our minds. He introduces this idea of three intellects: active, passive, and potential.
Oh boy, all right. Time for a brain workout. So it's like our minds have different settings depending on if we're interacting with the world or with God.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It's a really fascinating framework he lays out. So the active intellect, that's our everyday mind, right? It's planning, analyzing, problem solving, all those things we do to navigate the world.
Okay.
And then there's the passive intellect, which is much quieter, more receptive, open. That's the part of us that can actually receive divine wisdom, that can connect with something beyond just our own thoughts.
So if the active intellect is like sending emails and scheduling meetings, the passive intellect is more like meditation.
Yeah.
Just being present.
Exactly. You got it. And the third one, the potential intellect, that's where things get really interesting. That's the fertile ground, where those seeds of divine knowledge can actually take root and grow. Think of it like a garden, but it's being tended by a higher power.
Okay.
Eckhart argues that true understanding, those big aha moments of spiritual clarity, they come when we can quiet that active chatterbox in our minds and allow God to take the lead, working through our passive, receptive intellect.
So it's almost like we have to get out of our own way, stop trying to figure it all out, and create space for something greater to come through.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when I'm trying to force myself to be creative, like nothing comes out.
Right.
But when I can relax, let go a little, that's when the inspiration really flows.
That's such a good analogy because it's that same kind of surrender Eckhart's talking about. And what's fascinating is that he acknowledges even when we achieve that state of connection with God, it might not be permanent. He suggests that God sometimes deliberately withdraws from us.
Wait, seriously? Why would God do that? It seems like if you'd worked hard to make that connection, you'd want it to last forever.
It's like you have those peak experiences in life, but then you got to come back down to earth and integrate them into, your everyday routine.
Right.
Eckhart uses the example of St. Paul, who had this incredibly intense mystical vision.
Right.
And Eckhart argues that if we were constantly experiencing God's full glory all the time, we just couldn't handle it.
We'd fry our circuits.
Totally, like our poor brains would just short circuit.
Yeah.
So God gives us these glimpses, these moments of deep connection.
Right.
And then steps back, to give us time to process and grow.
That makes sense. You can't go from 0 to marathon runner overnight.
Exactly. You got to build those spiritual muscles over time.
Yeah.
But here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
What about all the doing in our lives, you know? Like, how do we balance this inner stillness with actually helping others, being engaged in the world?
Right, because it's like, am I supposed to just sit and meditate all day if I want to? Like, really connect with God?
Right.
Doesn't seem very useful.
Exactly. And that's actually a common misunderstanding about, like, mystical teachings in general.
Yeah.
Eckhart actually emphasizes both contemplation and action are important.
Okay.
He uses this example of Mary and Martha from the Bible,
Right.
who are both devoted to Jesus, but in different ways.
Right. One's at his feet and one's in the kitchen.
Exactly. Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, just soaking up his wisdom.
Right.
And Martha's running around, you know, making sure everyone's fed and things are tidy.
Right. And then Jesus kind of says Mary chose the better part,
Right.
which always made me feel bad for Martha. Like, oh, I'm a Martha. I guess I'm not that spiritually advanced.
I know. But Eckhart has this really interesting take on that whole dynamic.
Okay.
He sees both of their approaches as valuable, essential even.
Okay.
So think of it this way. Mary, by being so attentive to Jesus, she's nourishing her soul, right?
Dang.
Which then allows her to serve from this place of deep inner peace.
Mhm.
And that makes her service even more powerful.
Right.
It's not about choosing one over the other. It's recognizing how they work together.
Right.
Contemplation fuels our actions. It allows us to actually channel that divine energy into meaningful deeds.
So it's not about escaping the world. It's more like becoming a conduit for something bigger to flow through us.
Yes.
Okay, so then how are we supposed to maintain that inner connection when, like, our minds are just, oh my gosh, complete chaos most of the time?
Right.
Like, how do you quiet the mind when it just feels like a never-ending scroll of to-dos and anxieties?
Well, Eckhart was way ahead of his time on that one.
Okay.
He says, even when you silence that active intellect, images, thoughts, they're still going to pop up.
Right.
But here's the really wild part.
Okay.
He believes that those images are actually placed there by God, who becomes like this master workman shaping our thoughts and actions from within.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. That's a pretty radical concept.
It is.
So it's not about, like, emptying our minds completely. It's about, what, changing how we relate to those thoughts.
Yeah.
Seeing them as potentially coming from a higher source.
That's one way to look at it.
Yep.
It's like Eckhart saying, look, you can try to control everything, you know,
Wow.
or you can surrender and let God work through you.
So instead of being the composer, we become the instrument and just let a greater melody flow through.
I love that analogy. And this whole idea of surrendering control is really tied to another key point Eckhart makes,
Okay.
and that's detachment.
Okay.
He says, finding true inner peace means letting go of our need to cling to things,
Right.
outcomes, possessions, even our own ideas about ourselves.
Easier said than done.
Way easier said than done.
Yeah.
Because we're hardwired to, like, define ourselves by what we do, what we have, what we believe. It's terrifying to think about letting go of all that.
Right. Like, I'm going to disappear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Eckhart argues that clinging to all that stuff actually creates inner turmoil.
Okay.
Our intellects, they're always searching for solid ground, you know, a sense of certainty.
Right.
And we mistakenly believe we're going to find that by holding on to all these things outside ourselves.
Right. So we're seeking security in all the wrong places,
Exactly.
fleeting pleasures or accomplishments,
Yeah.
instead of tapping into, like you said, what's already there.
That wellspring of peace that's already within us.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And Eckhart emphasizes that true contentment, it doesn't come from attaching ourselves to things that are constantly changing,
Right.
but from connecting to that unchanging essence of God that he sees as like the foundation of all existence.
So shifting from the temporary to the eternal,
Yes,
from the surface to the depths.
exactly.
Okay, but if that divine essence is already within us,
Yeah.
and what's with all this talk about surrender and detachment?
Yeah.
Whose will are we surrendering to if it's not even really our own?
That's a great question. And Eckhart would say we're surrendering to our true selves,
Okay.
to that divine spark that resides within each of us.
Mhm.
He uses this image of a voice crying out in the wilderness,
Okay.
urging us to become empty vessels, receptive to God's presence and action within. He even suggests that our desires, our good intentions, these are actually gifts from the Holy Spirit working through us.
So it's not about being passive or giving up our free will. It's more about aligning ourselves with something greater.
Yes, and letting that force guide us.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that brings us to another point I find really fascinating about Eckhart's teachings.
Okay.
He doesn't completely disregard traditional religious practices.
Because he seems a little wishy-washy on that.
Yeah.
Like, are rituals and disciplines necessary or not?
Right.
What's the deal with all the prayer beads and pilgrimages if we're supposed to be finding God within?
It's a good question, and he doesn't necessarily say they're pointless.
Okay.
He sees them more like training wheels. They're
Okay.
helpful for beginners because they create structure and discipline,
Right.
which can help us detach from distractions and turn our attention inward.
Okay.
But he makes this really interesting observation.
Okay.
Once that inner connection to the divine is strong, those outer practices, they might naturally fall away.
Like a butterfly shedding a cocoon. So it's not that they're wrong. It's more like they served their purpose.
Yeah, like they helped us build the foundation.
Right, for a deeper level of connection.
Exactly. And Eckhart uses this analogy of someone who's taken like vows of prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, right? And then they enter a monastic order and they're released from those previous vows
Oh, interesting.
because now they're living under this whole new set of commitments.
So those outer vows helped create the container
Yes.
for a deeper transformation to happen.
Exactly.
And once that transformation happens, you don't need a container in the same way.
Yes, and Eckhart seems to believe that this principle applies to all forms of spiritual practice, really. They're
Awesome.
all ultimately pointing us towards this inner freedom and union with God.
Right.
And once we've tasted that freedom, the forms themselves might naturally fall away.
But he's not saying, like, just ditch your practices randomly.
Oh, definitely not. No, he emphasizes discernment, listening to that inner guidance.
Yeah.
It's really about a personalized approach to spirituality, one that evolves alongside you as you grow and change.
So trust your own inner compass.
Yes.
Find what truly nourishes you
Exactly.
instead of some, like, one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. It's about being responsive to the movements of the spirit within.
This whole conversation reminds me of something Eckhart said at the beginning of the sermon.
Okay.
This idea that we need to be about our Father's business.
Yes.
Like, it's not enough to just have these heady ideas about God.
Yeah.
We have to actually live them out.
Absolutely. Yeah. For Eckhart, spiritual growth wasn't just about accumulating knowledge or even having these amazing mystical experiences.
Right.
It was about allowing those experiences to transform us.
Right, from the inside out.
Yeah. And to actually impact how we think, how we act, how we move through the world.
So not about escaping the world, but becoming more ourselves within it.
Yes.
More fully ourselves.
And with something so much bigger.
Exactly. And that process of alignment, that surrender to a greater will, that's what he means by being about our Father's business.
It's about becoming instruments of love, instruments of compassion.
Yes, beautifully said. So, to bring it all back to our listeners, what do you think? Is this journey that Eckhart describes, this radical surrender to something beyond ourselves, finding God not just in moments of meditation, but also in the messiness of life, is it a path worth exploring?
That's the question he leaves us with, isn't it? It's a challenging path, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's one that offers such incredible potential for transformation, for lasting peace. And maybe that's why his words still resonate so powerfully even after all these centuries,
Yeah.
They invite us to dive deeper into the mystery of our own being and to really explore the depths of our connection to the divine.
Something to ponder as we navigate our own busy, messy, complicated lives. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time as we continue to explore the world of big ideas.